Welcome back. You're watching Global Eye. China is ready to bolster its relationship with 50 African nations. Chinese President Xi Jinping hosted more than 24 African leaders earlier this week, promising cooperation in infrastructure, energy, education at the China-African Cooperation Summit. With the summit concluding, China has pledged to pump in nearly $51 billion over the next 3 years, adding that this move could create at least 1 million jobs. Addressing the summit, President Xi said China and Africa account for one-third of the world population. He added that without their modernization, there will be no global modernization. Meanwhile, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has warned that African nations' inadequate access to debt relief was a recipe for social unrest. Now, joining us to take this forward is Gurjit Singh, India's ambassador to the African Union formerly, and also former Indian ambassador to South Africa, Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia. Thank you very much for joining us. Ambassador Gurjit Singh, if I were to begin with you, several of these countries which were present at the China-Africa Forum, they were dealing with a lot of debt stress over the past few months. We've seen tensions in Kenya also as a result. How do you see the China-Africa handshake in a moment like this?
I see it as an unmanaged response, because all these countries which have severe debt problems, and you mentioned Kenya, there is Zambia, there is Ethiopia, they were all waiting there for more projects and more loans. So it is not very clear how well managed they are, because if they are going to borrow more at the usual Chinese opaque terms, it is only going to increase their stress. Furthermore, the large number of projects that China is offering typically lack a business plan to recover the money. They do not build local capacities and become like albatrosses around most necks. So therefore, this entire thing about 51 billion more is not entirely loans. And Africa is interested in them, but I think they're more interested in the grants and the interest-free loans which may come their way.
Right, important points there. And what we have heard is that assistance this time, Ambassador Bhatia, would be in the Chinese yuan, which possibly indicates that China wants to internationalize the yuan even more. How do you think India is reworking its plan for Africa? Over the past 10 to 15 years, we've been strongly engaging with the African Union. But do you feel that now there is a need for a template for a greater engagement, greater investments as well?
Thank you very much, Parikshit. Your question about India comes in the context of the summit which has just ended involving China and Africa. And I think I can say that India, the Africanists, are deciphering as to what takeaways we can draw from this summit. There is considerable concern on our part as to how we can step up our role in Africa. The role of India in Africa has been quite significant, and I think in our study it shows that in the previous decade, from 2015 to 2019, Africa really commanded very high degree of political attention, with our president, vice president, prime minister traveling to African countries almost every second or third month. But since COVID happened, and then we had to battle with the consequences of Ukraine and Gaza and the other conflicts, and we have other priorities in our own neighborhood, in the extended neighborhood, in Southeast Asia. So it is possible to argue that our attention to Africa has been somewhat lowered. This needs to be remedied. And you asked about how to do this. The answer is very simple. I think we simply have to expand our across-the-board interaction with Africa. We have to make more financial resources available for projects in Africa, and we have to listen to Africans more.
Very important point. Ambassador Gurjit Singh, we believe that you're also somebody who's been closely engaging with the government, giving your recommendations at different forums from time to time, along with Ambassador Bhatia. If I were to ask you, how can India, with the kind of economic and financial problems that we have of our own, yes, we're one of the fastest growing economies in the world, but we have our own economic priorities. Keeping that in mind, how can we put more financial resources on the table because we are being challenged by a financially very strong country?
No point in discussing India and China in Africa together because the quantum that China puts in is much more, but India's relationship with China is more diverse and more of longer standing and perhaps better respected. So I don't think they fall in the same category. In some cases, China copies the Indian playbook. For instance, their emphasis on human resource development. That was an Indian idea. Now, this time they have announced a kind of a tariff-free access to Chinese African LDCs. India did it in 2008. So many things they are copying from us, but there is no way that we can provide $51 billion like they are doing. But at the same time, I think India is more cognizant that debt stress rules in Africa. And our loans are within the same ambit that the IMF looks at, not like the Chinese. Therefore, I think we should seriously move towards an FDI-led approach where we provide guarantees and consulting rather than loans, and Indian private sector, along with funds from third countries who are largely what we call trilateral cooperation, they should have PPP projects and investments in Africa from everything across the board, from MSMEs to infrastructure. I think that approach is what we need to take.
Right. Coming back to you, Ambassador Bhatia. Now, when we speak about the geopolitical battle over the African Union, now this is a region very rich in copper, gold, lithium, rare earth minerals. This is something that every country is wanting to build resilient supply chains in. Do you think China's battle right now is a geopolitical rivalry with the United States or a geopolitical rivalry with India or India and US together?
I think I would plug for the very last alternative that you drew. There is no doubt that the principal rivalry or competition is between the US and China has worked out that in terms of its global position, Africa commands a very, very important role. And therefore, China has been going on in a very systematic and comprehensive manner to win over Africa. And look at what they have achieved in the past 24 years. Over the years, the African resistance, grievances, etc. have come down, and Africans feel much more comfortable dealing with China in a much bigger way. And so clearly, not just India, but even America and the US and European Union find themselves on the back foot. As far as India is concerned, India obviously is going to be eventually the third largest economy. The important thing is that India, by simply ideas, by creativity, by its technology, by its good governance, all those things, by offering them to Africa, it can make a headway. But as our growth picks up, as our prosperity expands, I think it's very important for India to show greater generosity in terms of making resources available to Africa. I'm not talking just of loans. I'm talking very much of a mixture of loans, grants, and investment, just as the Chinese have been doing. Because frankly, without backing our diplomacy with material support, it's very difficult for our business community and for our diplomatic community to make a big headway in Africa. That is the plain truth, and it can be camouflaged in any elegant manner that you wish to take.
Right. Ambassador Gurjit Singh, today we're all seeking cheaper alternatives to energy transition. How can we make energy transition in the most smoothest manner, with the least amount of disruption and the most cost-effective manner? If China is able to make these big grants, which it can over the next 3 years, to debt-ridden countries in Africa, and they somehow end up controlling some of these supply chains within African Union of these critical minerals and also lithium, gold, copper, how do you think this is going to affect economies like India?
I said there is no competition. The Chinese have had a hold over African critical minerals, and we are just about starting our policy and search for it. Similarly, we are the pioneers in trying to bring solar energy to Africa, but the components of solar cells are all Chinese. Now, in this summit, the Chinese have put a lot of emphasis on green development and solar energy. So they are also now hogging the limelight of that agenda on which earlier they were behind. So we are being challenged everywhere, but it is for us to change the narrative. We must put in money where we can make it work. Now, all the G7 countries put together do not have a big lending program to Africa. Lending has come mainly privately through bonds, which are now facing haircuts. So we should look for more guarantees to come from large Japanese, European, and American institutions, which should be matched by private sector FDI and a buy-in by the Africans. In all these plans, particularly the Chinese plans, the view of the African is ignored. The Africans want that the projects that are implemented should be from Agenda 2063. I have not seen the Chinese, or for that matter, the G7, pursue any of the projects which is in Agenda 2063. So I think this reformulation and looking at Africa with greater empathy is truly required. Prioritize Africa, but also their preferences.
All right, prioritize Africa and also their preferences. With that, we've come to the end of Global Eye. Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhatia, Ambassador Gurjit Singh, for joining us on the program with that very interesting take and cues for India from the China-African Foreign meeting that has taken place in Beijing. That's all we have time for here on Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.
Hello and welcome everyone. Today we will speak about the life insurance industry, and what a time to speak about that industry. We are in a year where there is a strong growth which the industry has in front of itself, but at the same time there are certain regulatory changes in the form of surrender value. There is some bit of margin pressure which the companies in the sector are experiencing because of the strong sales of market-linked products.